Last year there was a lot of buzz about some indie game from a developer who made one critically acclaimed game previously, and it's been a good while since they've released anything. It's a game that I bought 6 months ago and didn't play until recently because that's just how I roll, even if I had nothing else to play at the time. So, Inside is a 3D, 2D puzzle platformer developed by Danish indie studio Playdead, a studio renowned for one whole other game featuring a mostly gray color palette, progression to the right, and numerous instances of child death. So it seems like they didn't get their fill with any of that and decided to make Inside. I haven't played their previous game Limbo, but it seems like I don't need to, as I'm getting a similar enough experience and I can only stomach so much ambiguous storytelling and platforming physics puzzles before an aneurysm begins to form in my head. So really, this kind of game ain't my cup of tea, and really, most indie games aren't. But the few I've played I would still consider exceptional. They just never stick to me for whatever reason. Now, I could just stop talking about this game and throw it into the not for me, so I'll be nice to it, trash fire, but screw that. Instead, I'll start by being very nice to it, as even with the issues it has, I really can't look past how incredibly well made it is. Before I start though, I must give a minor spoiler warning for this game. I'm not going to get too specific with most things, however the issues I have pertain to the ending, so I won't tiptoe that much later on when I get there. So let's get started then. Inside gleams from start to finish with a polish and attention to detail rarely seen in games, which certainly gives reason to the long development period of like 6 years. It's most noticeable in how the character interacts with the world, having unique responses to most interactions. The insane quality of the environment's art style, effects, and unique pieces, coupled with the creep of ambient noise and clamor of sudden changes to the objects in the world, makes for a discomforting but intoxicating and thrilling journey. As for the experience itself, the whole game is a series of sweaty scenarios and minimal physics puzzles, and all along the way, the wide-eyed, tight-lipped expression the enticing world induced rarely left my face. Simply put, this game is a fucking ride. It's tough for a game to maintain the level of not only polish but discomfort and edge this one manages to for roughly 3 hours. Not only for the exceptional aspects of the art and sound that I listed above, but the unyielding barrage of unique situations and uses of the environment throughout. Now, when describing a game at its highest level, the amount of dimensions the game operates on is usually the first descriptor, as it paints the stage much better than anything that follows, but Inside's use of the dimensional planes are a bit unique. There's a term that's widely accepted to explain what exactly a 3D polygonal game operating on a 2D plane is, that being 2.5D or 2.5D. On a quick side note, I don't know what the fuck the opposite of this is considered, where it's 2D sprites on a 3D plane, like those special levels in Sonic CD, or that Sin Time and Eternity. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can still be saved. Anyway, no games that are considered 2.5, 2.5D, whatever, pop into my head, like the opposite, so I don't have much of a measuring stick for this one. But I'll bet Inside is exceptional, as its use of the third dimension is not purely stylistic. That's cool though, I know sprites are hard. The unique thing here is that entities existing perpendicular to the designated 2D path are often dangers or a part of the solution, and their ability to operate is not exclusive to the second dimension, making for scenarios and solutions that involve the game space's depth. Now to move on to the actual scenarios, it's time to talk puzzles. Inside's puzzles are designed in a precise single solution manner, meaning if something was unsuccessful, it likely isn't the player's fault. Although, that didn't stop me from bashing my head against a clear failure up to 10 times. And there was that one time that I almost found the solution but fell into the water and crossed that possibility out in my head for 10 minutes. Player errors are rare in something like this as it's so polished. Multiple attempts of a single failing method end the same way, setting the precedent that it's very clear if something won't work. However, possible player errors can be an issue, as the player may feel that what was attempted and failed at is on the game's end, telling the player that won't work, leaving them to attempt other solutions deemed failures until looping back to the correct one. While I sound negative about this, kind of like how I do everything, it's not a huge deal at all, just a possible issue that comes with a high quality of polish, as dips in quality are stark in contrast to the rest of the experience. Plus, it's not like I never had what I needed to solve these puzzles. The unique elements are taught with finesse, and puzzles are never overloaded with too many pieces, having them feel manageable. And the unique mechanics and pieces are used just enough to feel exhausted and fulfilled by the end. And along the way, there's a shocking amount of unique one-off pieces and even new mechanics presented in the final segments, keeping the game engaging while the atmosphere and mystery does the same. The game also injects the player with and runs on this mentality of, if it seems possible, it is. A great mentality not only when designing something consistent, especially when dealing with physics-based gameplay, but also for the player to have as it helps them through the solution process. For me, this mentality was induced early on as I began to die a few times per scenario or puzzle, which leads me into one of my two big issues with the gameplay. The first issue is the trial and error nature of this game. Now, I must make a big distinction here, as trial and error comes so comfortably along with puzzles, and that's all good, but there's a difference between trying possible solutions when everything is completely presented and being spurred into something without much time to figure things out, especially if the solution requires breaking a precedent or convention. The former is working out a thought process, and the latter is reactionary. So, this game has two kinds of puzzles. Well, I'm going to define it as having two kinds of puzzles. I'll call them static puzzles and urgent puzzles. A fail state via death can exist in either of these, but the main difference is the rate at which these puzzles or scenarios can be solved. Static puzzles allow for the player to move at their own pace to determine and try solutions. Any risky, slim, or dangerous timing that is ever present in physics platformers is triggered by the player's actions here, rather than another force, unlike its counterpart. Urgent puzzles, or often urgent in cinematic scenarios, are the ones featuring some sort of dangerous entity that spurs the player into action. The problem with this is that it's trial and error with a fail state rather than something just not working. Many of these encounters don't allow for the player to take in the situation as well as they could, at their own pace, and often die a few times to shake off a convention, or because they could only guess what was off to the side of the screen. This kind of design is a double-edged sword, as when a player succeeds on the first go, it's awesome. A little rush of adrenaline and satisfaction. Hey, that happened exactly as intended. Nice, this game is so cool and designed well. At least that's what the developer hopes your unconscious is saying. However, a failure, or even worse, multiple failures, kill the moment, leaving any eventual success without much feeling of anything, or as dissatisfying, which is the opposite of how static puzzles go, which is generally frustration leading up to a satisfying, moment. The one big upside is that the unique deaths are pleasant. I mean, they're terrible. I mean, they're pleasant. Now, regardless of my satisfaction of how a child dies, one of the biggest offenders of this issue is a scenario that very easily tells the player to follow very specific actions and gives plenty of time for them to understand that. It's a very well executed and designed moment, as everything the player needs has been presented, and the anticipation and pace during this moment is slow and nerve-wracking. And the problem is that the end of the scenario harshly goes against the induced convention during the last few minutes. Well, they seem like minutes, it could be shorter than that, leaving me with the feeling that I had fucked something up when the answer is just, hey, you gotta run to the right, and even then the timing's unclear when I should start booking it. There are a few moments that break conventions like this, and a death is often the method to teach the player those rules no longer apply. Sure, it's not long to get back in the action, but a death is still considered a failure to most. Now, I should say, most urgent puzzles do present a clear solution or direction, since the number of pieces or possibilities are few. But for the ones that fail to present all the pieces in a proper way, simply have the surroundings be observable or necessary pieces be seen before the event is triggered. A few do this, but it'd be best practice if it was present throughout when possible. Between the two puzzle types, I found the most enjoyment out of the static puzzles, since I favor moving at my own pace, but I wouldn't say the urgent puzzles are the weaker aspect, as injecting a feeling of stress into the player in a grim and uncomfortable world like this only amplifies the experience overall. If anything, it's necessary to have both these types of situations, as they exist to complement each other. If it was all static puzzles, that could lead to a less enticing experience even if the world is intriguing, and having all urgent puzzles with no moments of catharsis or rest would possibly leave the player overwhelmed even with the brief length of this game. Now, moving on to the second big gameplay issue that is certainly smaller than the previous, is that a notable number of puzzles require too much traveling or back and forth to complete. Many of the areas are huge open spaces with backdrops that aren't too evocative or fascinating after the initial presentation, so they don't do too well in holding my interest a second or third time, as I go to shift or collect the piece or pieces of the puzzle that triggered the solution all the way on the other side of the room through a door and down a hallway. And even in the smaller rooms, the back and forth can feel sluggish, especially when the answer is known right away. The reason this isn't a game breaker is that the game isn't too long to begin with, and this downtime is best used to try and figure out what the fuck is happening in this world. Which leads me to why this game is ultimately, unfortunately, very disappointing. For all the wonderful presentation, polish, and execution Inside exemplifies, it falls flat in its ultimate moments to deliver any sort of payoff, connection, or explanation to the uncomfortable imagery and world throughout the game. The reasons behind the world's state and boy's actions are left to the player to interpret. The former is the most intriguing aspect of the game, as the world and bizarre happenings within it are the greatest pull to keep going. The wonder of why it's all like this, pushing the player to the right in hope of some answer. Instead, only to be met with a ton more questions and what I personally believe to be the most unintentionally hilarious finale I've ever experienced. I'm sure it was meant to be shocking or mind-blowing in some way, however, I'm not sure if hilarity was an intended response. But, regardless of how fucking funny that part is, the pull of the game is left with nothing, making the whole experience feel harshly lessened. So then of course I go and look up if there's a secret ending, cause of course there is. There are hidden objects that can be broken to get achievements with vague descriptions, and vague might be pushing it as some may as well be blank. But these collectibles and what they ultimately connect to act as the sole pieces to explain anything going on in this game. As once all the hidden objects are dealt with, a secret area becomes accessible where the secret ending can occur. So I watched this secret ending, and I almost wish I didn't because it just pissed me off instead of giving me anything good. Since instead of anything concrete to explain the world, it's instead a moment presenting something that resembles someone sitting at a computer desk, which is likely meant to represent the player, or even worse, the developer, and how this thing is controlling the boy. Yay! Meta commentary in place of anything interesting or creative, and still fuck all reason for the reason of the world state. I'm so mad I can't even talk. While I don't like this, it does give something of an explanation to the boy's motivation. And if not an answer, at least something for the player to dwell on. However, I'm inclined to believe this is simply a cop-out. Now, I don't think I'm crazier than normal when I say that meta commentary to explain something can be pretentious. Especially when it's the sole thing the game rides on to explain something and appear deep or clever. But instead, it's a catch-all contrivance to explain why something is the way it is, when really, the developer just wanted to do something and didn't care to or couldn't think of a reason, or possibly worse, believed this was brilliant. I did it. I'm the smartest. I'm being a bit mean here, but even with this catch-all, it only acts to create a reason for the character's drive in this game, something that should be addressed, but it gives little to nothing of the world's state. Sure, there are things to observe and say, oh yeah, they're doing some weird shit with humans. Oh, there's mind control home. Oh man, that one's a janitor. However, the extent of it never goes beyond that. A meta explanation of, oh, the boy was doing all this because you, the player, wanted to do it. Or, I am the developer and this is my world. Get it? You're doing it because I designed you to do it. Oh. Is a fucking terrible reason, or are fucking terrible reasons. Because even if that's the case, I wanted to do it because I was captivated by a world. Yet all I'm left with believing now is that this world was made with no substance, substantially invalidating those heavy feelings felt throughout. It feels like someone either had a cool idea and wanted to do a bunch of cool things and just did them without much thought, or really believes that having little to nothing for a player to use in interpreting a setting, story, or motivation is inherently deep or clever. And frankly, I don't know which of the two is worse, folly or pretension. So the last question to answer, or try to, is, what could have been done instead to tie everything together? Or rather, what could have been put in place to make the given reason work? Or at the very least, make it appear less empty and more thought out? I think the easiest answer is to place pieces in the world that give clues to what the entity in the secret ending is, or why it's there. Even if it's unclear, it would give the player something to draw a bunch of yarn strings to, something to chew on. These pieces could be detailed background objects or even interactable objects. The clues given from these would not only need to explain the secret ending, but more importantly give something for the player to draw any sort of reason to the world's state. Like, if I walk into a room with a whiteboard, that whiteboard needs to have something on it that has some meaning. Personally though, I'm in favor of a broken silence in the final segment of the game, where the onlookers are spouting uncontextualized things of note during the chaos, as that segment is a clear break from the game's subtlety, but it would still fit into the ambiguous nature of the game. Maybe that might go too far against what Inside sets out to do, but hey, if they didn't care to keep the precedence in gameplay, why hold on when it matters most, unless there really was no reason to anything that happened. While Inside is a great ride, it fails to give any satisfying reason to its mysteries, creating something terribly disappointing as it almost stuck the landing, leaving the game and the feelings it invoked empty. While I believe style over substance can work at times, this is not one of them. It is ironic though, because if someone were to ask me, hey, what's inside? I would just look at them, smirk a bit, and reply, nothing. Unless they were asking literally, because the game does answer that one, and it's hilarious. Or maybe it doesn't answer it, but it gives something. I could literally say, like, well, there's a moment where you're inside something. I truly was Playdead's inside. But yes, everything I just talked about with Inside's empty reasoning to its world and motivation, you can just pick that up and just drop all that, plop right all of that onto The Witness 2. Well, The Witness 1. It's the most pretentious game I've played. The only reason I'd recommend it, though, is that the puzzles are stellar and it doesn't hide how goddamn pretentious it is. So you know what you're getting by the end. Oh, not the fucking piss jar.